I'm Shmelis. Welcome to this video learning program. Dear my students, if you remember in our last topic or in our last session, we have seen grade 11 history. Under that previous lesson, we have seen unit 1, part 1. In this unit or in the first subtopic, we have seen the different definitions of history, historiography, and prehistory. Today, we are going to look the key elements in the study of history. Dear my learners, before we are going to learn this program, please don't forget to subscribe this video and share and like the video. As I have mentioned, the major topic of today's lesson is key elements in the study of history. Modern historical study involves a number of key elements of history. One of the decisive elements of history is sources. Sources are one of the decisive key elements in historical study. Why? Because no one can write history without sources. As you know, every statement of a history must be supported by evidences. These evidences or historical information is obtained from sources of history. So, sources are a major key element of history or historical study. Dear my learners, from all these points, you should have to know the importance of sources. Why? Because a history must be supported by sources. Because of this, some historians say history means sources. That means without source, no one can write history. The second element of history is interpretation of historical evidences. When you say interpretation of historical evidence means sources. Before we are going to use sources, we must interpret our sources or the meaning and originality of our primary or secondary or oral tradition. It must be interpreted. Otherwise, there could be a possibility of misrepresentation or wrong interpretation of historical evidences. The next decisive element of historical writing was presentation of the facts on paper, means writing a history. After a clear understanding of historical evidence, the next step is presenting all the facts without bias, means writing a history. Since the beginning of the 19th century, presenting of historical information was based on evidences, simple, readable, and attractive ways. However, before the 19th century, historical writing seems like a fiction without supporting evidences. But beginning from the 19th century, such types of tradition or writing history was completely changed using evidences, and the writing it must be simple, readable, and attractive way. The next one was objectivity. Dear learner, we have to know, or you should have to know, what objectivity means in the study of history. Objectivity or writing unbiased or undistorted history means truthfulness of a fact or historical accounts. Objectivity, it involves 1. Based on truth, accurate history, identifying the real or significant facts based on evidence, based on reliable primary sources. So, presenting all the facts, what all the facts say without any bias for or against is known as objectivity. Another very important element of history means methods of historical writing. Like other discipline, historical study has its own historical methods. In historical methods, it comprises the techniques and guidelines by which historians use primary sources and other evidences to conduct a research and then write a history, the form of account of the past. This is known as historical methodology. Dear my learner, in writing a history, there are different steps. For example, one of the first steps in writing history was collection of historical information or evidences. Why? Because without sources, no one can write history. After we have gathered or collect document or data or historical sources, the next step was source criticism. Means we have to criticize our sources before we are implementing or using the source. Sources, it might be source criticism. It might have internal and external source criticism. Interpretation could be the other steps in writing history. It means interpreting our historical facts. And finally, writing objectivity. Writing objectivity means we writing history without bias. Dear learner, now we are going to jump to the other very important lesson. Subtopics of this part is Ethiopian historiography. Still, my student, don't forget to subscribe and share and like this program, because in order to address many students who want to or who will to learn this video learning program. Ethiopian historiography. As you remember in our last session, the term historiography. Do you remember what we learned? What do you mean by historiography? Historiography, it means the writing of the history of historical writing. In Ethiopia, Ethiopia is one of the countries in the world that have indigenous historical traditions of writing since the beginning of the 14th century. Such indigenous writing, it was continued up to the 20th century. This traditional or indigenous historical writing in Ethiopia is or was known as chronicle. When I say chronicle, it was an account written by chroniclers about Ethiopian emperor, about their achievement and daily life. A series of chroniclers or a person or an individual who write a chronicle was known as chronicler, wrote almost exclusively about the achievement of Ethiopian emperors. The next indigenous form of historical writing in Ethiopia was hagiography. Hagiography, it was an indigenous writing system, mostly about the deeds of saints, means religious personalities. So you should have to identify chronicle from hagiography. As we have already tried to explain, chronicle, it is mostly secular about the deeds or achievements of Ethiopian emperor, whereas hagiography, this was a writing of history or deeds of saints, means religious personalities. These are a basis for the writing of Ethiopian history. However, both hagiography and chronicle have their own problem in writing history, but they still used as a basis for the writing of Ethiopian history. So now you are going to ask questions. When did modern Ethiopian study was started? As it was known, in Europe, Ethiopian studies were founded in the last quarter of the 17th century by a German historian named Job Ludolf. Ludolf also wrote the first modern history of Ethiopia, which was published in 1684. So, until the early 1960s, Ethiopian study was focused mostly on northern Ethiopia. It was the establishment of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, or IS, in 1963 at the then Haile Selassie First University that changed this pattern. Until then, Ethiopian study focused on the north because of the northern part of the country had the following advantage. Now we are going to look the different factors which helped for the northern Ethiopia to be studied in before 1963. The major factor or reason was the Norse had a written language that served to keep records, one of the first advantage. The second advantage, ancient Greek, Roman, and Arab writers left important information about their region. The next advantage is several sources on the Christian kingdom are also available in Egyptian Coptic churches. The Norse provided archaeological sources for the study of the history of the region. Means northern Ethiopia, in the northern Ethiopia, many archaeological findings were conducted which helped for the study of northern Ethiopia. When we come to the south, available physical remains were not yet been studied. The South had no written language and so had not kept records of its past. Therefore, compared to the North, in the South there was lack of sources of history. Besides, the scholars had been reluctant to collect and use oral tradition as reliable historical sources until 1960s. That means up to the opening of IS in Addis Ababa University. In this regard, one of the problems of Ethiopian study was imbalance of sources. Means in the north we can have relatively historical sources, but in the south there was scanty of historical information. That means a major problems of Ethiopian studies until 1963 was imbalance of sources. The next problems of Ethiopian historiography up to 1960s was comprehensiveness. When we say comprehensive, history must be comprehensive, means there must be political history, economic history, and social history. So prior to the 1963, there was lack of comprehensiveness. Even the Northern history, it was mostly political history, mostly a war history. This was because of most studies focused on political history of the country. Another problem in the study of Ethiopian history was lack of objectivity. When you say objectivity, lack of objectivity, there was a tendency of bias, like the chronicles of the Christian emperors. With this, we are winding up our lesson. So, my learners, don't forget to subscribe, share, and like my program. For the next period, we are going to deal different aspects of historical writings. And welcome.